Well, hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming on this Friday evening. And I would welcome you to the 9th Hormuud Distinguished Lecture, made possible by a generous grant from Hormuud Telecom Somalia. The lectures are to focus on an aspect of leadership, development, and democracy in Africa. Tonight's presentation will be delivered by Professor Abena Busia, a Ghanaian diplomat, scholar, teacher, and poet. Professor Busia will treat us to a lecture titled On the Demanding Forward Flight of the Diasporan Sankofa Bird, Reflections on the First Preparatory Congress of the African Union's 6th Region. Before we begin, I would like to share some highlights from Professor Busia's distinguished past. Born in Ghana to a family of renown, she received her B.A., M.A., and D.Phil from Oxford University. An associate professor of literature and women's and gender studies at Rutgers University for many years, Professor Busia was appointed Ghana's ambassador to Brazil in 2017. Professor Busia has a strong record of service to a range of organizations and causes. She was a founding board member, president, and lifetime member of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, known as ASWAD. She was a founding board member of the African Women's Development Fund and of the African Women's Development Fund USA, the first Pan-African foundation to support women's rights organizations in Africa. She is a lifetime member and served as chair of the African Literature Association, a former board member and lifetime member of the African Studies Association. Professor Busia gave the ASA Bashoran Abiola Distinguished Lecture in 2005. As professor of literature and women's and gender studies at Rutgers University, Professor Busia was co-director and co-editor of the path-breaking Women Writing Africa project, a multi-volume anthology that gathered together a range of women's voices that recognized women's unique cultural production. Professor Busia was also the co-editor of Theorizing Black Feminisms, 1993, and many articles and book chapters focusing on Black women's writing, Black feminisms, and cultural studies, and African American diasporic literature, as well as 2 poetry collections. Finally, Professor Busia is the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including a Fulbright Hays Group Projects Abroad grant that enabled her, along with 2 Rutgers historians, to lead an interdisciplinary program called Teaching the History of the Slave Trade Routes of Ghana and Benin. She was also awarded an Andrew Mellon Fellowship in Bryn Mawr College's English Department, an Institute for American Cultures Fellowship at the Center for African American Studies at UCLA, and a visiting lectureship in Yale University's program of African and Afro-American Studies. She also received the Rutgers University President's Award for Distinguished Public Service, and notably, in March 2011, the African Women's Development Fund marked the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day by recognizing Professor Busia as one of 50 inspirational African feminists. Clearly, we are fortunate to have the honor of hosting Professor Busia in the 2024 Hormuud Distinguished Lecture. Without further ado, I'm happy to present to you Professor Abena Busia. Thank you so much. I haven't realized it's almost 20 years. It's like
Good evening. It's really very good to be here. It's a little worrying. I hadn't realized that it's almost 20 years since I gave the Abiola lecture, in 2005. But then I was saying earlier, I discovered African studies as an undergraduate when it was still pretty much a one-man operation when I found James Duffy in that attic building on the edge of Brandeis campus back in 1974. So I've been attached to ASA for 50 years and a member for something like 40, which is a little worrying, but here we go. I'm actually very happy to be here. I haven't been in quite a while because I've been sitting in Brazil. And so I feel it's kind of special and appropriate that the first public presentation I'm doing since my mandate as ambassador to Brazil ended 13 days ago is to speak at ASA. I got home, slept for 7 days, and then turned around and came here. And when I was thinking of what I wanted to speak about this evening, I felt I should honor the global Africa theme of this meeting, as well as reflect on my experiences as a diplomat over the last 7 years. But I also wanted to find a subject that went beyond the bilateral diplomatic concerns of my own country and embraced the concerns of the Southern American region I was sent to serve. Because the Ghana mission to Brazil serves not only Brazil, but it is accredited to all 12 countries of continental South America. As it turned out, the time I was worrying about how to bring all these disparate things together, we in Brazil were actually preparing for the Congress of the African Union's 6th region, which was to be held in Salvador de Bahia, a meeting which was seen as preparatory to the African Union's endorsement of the 9th Pan-African Congress to be held in Lomé at the end of October this year. So it actually proved an ideal confluence of events. Although in truth, I've been thinking about the issues surrounding the mobilization of the 6th region for some time. And the more I worked on the presentation, I realized the less I knew. The first moment I had to address some of my concerns in public was in May of 2023, was actually Africa Union Day. We were celebrating African Union Day at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil, and I was asked to speak about, the question of the diaspora. And at that time, we were working in confidence that the meeting that was to take place in Salvador was going to take place the following November. Well, it didn't. And then it was to take place in February, and it didn't. And then it was to take place in May, and it didn't. And it finally took place in August of this year. And as I've indicated, that convening was conceived as preparatory to the 9th Pan-African Congress, which was scheduled for the last week of October of this year. Therefore, when I sent off my proposed title for this lecture, which was in the months between the Salvador Convention and the proposed Lomé Congress, I set that title in full confidence that my concluding remarks this evening would be based on the results of that expected Congress. And it's perhaps apropos of the concerns I want to raise here that that Congress seems to be following the way of the conventions before it, because in truth, it did not take place. It was abruptly postponed about a month before the scheduled date with no explanation, no new forward date. But I'll return to that point. First, a word on my title, on the demanding forward flight of the Diasporan Sankofa bird. And somewhere I should be able to. I presume everybody knows what it looks like. But my title is not just a poetic flight of fancy to come up with an interesting sounding title. In the end, each word does have a point, including especially the word demanding. which is fraught with the need for inquiry. Because I mean demanding, both in the sense of something insistent and persistent, as well as something that is challenging, arduous. And for the unlikely few of you who do not know what the bird looks like, there it is. Its singular feature, of course, is that its neck is turned, looking backwards. But it's important to bear in mind that the bird is not running backwards. I chose this version because I like this one, because you can see the feet are facing forward. It's important to see the feet are pointing forward, so that's the direction. There are some where you can actually see the feet in motion, but couldn't find that. But it is important that the bird is moving forwards but turning backwards. As you may know, Sankofa is a shorthand for a proverb, which basically means if you've forgotten something, go back and fetch it. And it reminds us that the desired forward movement can't take place if you've left something behind, if you've left something valuable behind. But the point is that something valuable is what empowers us to move forward. The symbol has become so treasured in the diaspora because it's viewed as the symbol for reclaiming our African heritage, knowing your past. And that is the egg, fragile and in need of defending, which represents the past. The call to reclaim it is insistent. The means to do so, especially in the context in which I'm speaking, as a mobilized and legitimately activated, coherent community, remains challenging. This is an enormous task in the context of the African Union, and I want to use this opportunity to speak about why we shouldn't be surprised by the daunting nature of mobilizing the sixth region, and let alone follow it up with the 9th Pan-African Congress under the formalized, somewhat corporate style, UN style of the African Union. If you look at a map of the African Union, you will see very clearly the difference between the sixth region and all the others, which has practical, structural, and administrative consequences. First, the other regions are all continentally based, delineated by regional landmass, and divided into the distinct, mostly contiguous nation-states contained within each region of the continent. There are 7 countries in the North African region, 10 in the southern, 15 in West Africa, 14 in East, 9 in Central Africa, and then there is the 6th region of the diaspora, where we are given not numbers of nations, but an estimated population of approximately 170 million people. This is both the challenge and the opportunity. It's an opportunity of this region that led to the 2003 Heads of State Summit declaration that the, quote, AU decides to recognize the African diaspora as an effective entity contributing to economic and social development of the continent. But what in 2003 did the heads of state mean by the African diaspora? 2 years later, they saw fit to define it in the report of the meeting of the experts from the member states on the definition of the African diaspora. They spent 2 years trying to figure it out, and they declared that the AU meant, quote, people of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and the building of the African Union. However, it is that very phrase, people of African origin, which has led to the great debate, especially in countries like the United States, where a large, recent 20th century migration lives alongside a large domestic community of Afro-descendants of centuries-long standing. There's no time at this juncture to elaborate on the complex history of the concept of the African diaspora, a designation which brackets many distinct and overlapping groups. So I'm going to ask you to accept that I, here, am working with three chronological configurations, sometimes in tension. The most recent grouping is the one comprising those sometimes in the United States at least called heritage children in their host lands of Europe and the United States. They are born abroad of immigrant parents who most importantly raise them as best they can in homes that are culturally the best approximations of their own homelands that they could make. So in these homes, the combinations of food, language, clothing, ceremonies, and everyday rituals have marked their children out as Ghanaian, Moroccan, Cameroonian, Somali, whatever, of that heritage. In a sense, these children are marked as foreigners in the lands of their birth, where their parents, loved ones, and caregivers do not consider home. The second, and perhaps initially the pivotal group for the AU, are people like myself and possibly many of you, my colleagues, contemporaries in this room. People born and at least partially raised at home on the continent, who may have followed parents into economic or political exile or some other reason for migration, and left only after schooling had started, or went of their own accord for further education at a higher level, and who, however many years or decades away, eventually return or plan to return or live with the myth of return to the place they considered unambiguously a homeland. Whatever the manifold reasons for spending a lifetime away, we live with the idea that we're going to go home. We have a clear memory of a kingship group on the continent, even if we left as children. For us, the demarcation, geographic, cultural, and sometimes even moral, between homeland and hostland remains emotionally clear. And I believe it fair to say that we are the group that was the initial focus of the African Union when the debates about diaspora began. We are those ready to lend that economic and political support being called for. However, as we found out, it didn't take long for that notion of the African diaspora to be fiercely challenged by the communities most people outside the continent of Africa think of when the term African diaspora is used today. Those millions of people scattered around the world, particularly in South America, the Caribbean, and North America, and I just have to say, as a Brazil chauvinist, the largest population of those Africans are not in the United States, as the popular imagination would have it, but in Brazil and the Caribbean. It is these populations whose dispersal was caused by the cataclysmic and traumatic transatlantic slave trade, whose existence in millions outside the African continent, who have over the last century and a half forced an engagement with the concept of African diaspora. There can be no argument that the transatlantic slave trade altered the processes and landscapes of human history on at least 3 continents, if not more. Its effects linger with us to this day, for good or ill, because those captured peoples changed the known world at every level and made the modern world in which we live today. I don't think there can be any argument that if you're thinking globally of world history, the notion of the world centered on the Mediterranean shifting to a world centered around the Atlantic was created by the movement of our bodies and the skills and so on that we brought to both the old world and the new world. Making of the modern world is made by the transportation of African bodies. And so the realms of demography and history, all the cultural arts, including language, food, sacred knowledge, you name it, have been inexorably transformed by the 400-year legacy of those forced movements. This group are also a target of opportunity, and after 7 years in South America, I believe them to be a largely underestimated site of alliances. I arrived in South America as Ghana's first female ambassador on the 29th of December 2017, resident in Brasilia, but accredited to every country on the continent. And I learnt them off by heart on my first day in office: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. In the 7 years, and to be precise, 6 years, 11 months, and 1 day afforded me, I had the privilege also of becoming the first Ghanaian ambassador to present my credentials to all 12 presidents, one of whom is currently in jail. So, you know, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, but I even made it to Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And in almost every country, I engaged not only with the resident Ghanaian communities, and there are resident Ghanaian communities in the most surprising places. We discovered a whole community of teachers in Ecuador who we didn't know were there until COVID hit. Their contracts ran out and they couldn't go home, and that's when they remembered they had a mission in Brasilia. But we engaged with those Ghanaians, but also with Afro-descended communities of all those nations. And as in other parts of the world, the differences between those two communities are sometimes crucial, sometimes negligible, but always present. That is to say, we must never forget that migrations and movements are an ever-present factor of human life and have been so for as long as recorded human memory. And then, I don't have the space here to discuss this. I do want to recognize that though the stress on the transatlantic slave trade is comprehensible, it does often obliterate other histories, in particular, the history of those millions of Africans who for thousands of years were part of the flow of human movement and migration in and out of the continent and have lived in all parts of the world for centuries, but who had ancestry and mythologies which trace them back to an African homeland. They are very often unjustifiably neglected collective. You know, we kind of, those of us interested in diaspora, eagerly look for books like, you know, Blacks in Tudor England and so on, because somebody is remembering that there we had histories of movement before the transatlantic slave trade. Furthermore, we more frequently need to raise questions about the way that traumatic history sometimes overtakes the stories of millions of Africans who are displaced from their homeland but still living in various states of security or insecurity, comfort or precarity on the continent itself today. That is to say, again, the term diaspora is frequently used to mean outside of Africa. But if you are a Ghanaian living in Namibia, are you not part of a diaspora? And where do you get counted? So these histories, which can't be ignored but can't really be tackled here, are important because they too raise the question of how are they or are they not integrated into the population counted as part of the sixth region in question. Who composes that sixth region? And this becomes important because we're talking at heart about formal representation. That's what makes this important to think about. What I want to emphasize is that we live with different modes of dispersal which continue to impact our daily lives in visible and invisible ways, with greater or lesser impact. And as I've said, in many academic settings, we can display a tendency to focus on the forced removals of us as peoples, occasioned by the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. And it's important to do so because of the peculiar nature of that trade has had a lasting impact on the history of the world on all sides of the Atlantic. Nonetheless, as I say, it's important to bear in mind that when we speak of African diaspora, there are always in that mix people who, as Ivan van Sertima asserted for North America, came before the Mayflower, as well as those who in the United Kingdom we identify as the post-World War II Windrush generation. I am among, and I literally, the little village I grew up in England was actually on the River Windrush. So it was very real to me. The Empire Windrush was named after a river in which I grew up. So all of these arrivals are living willingly or unwittingly, cheek by jowl together in contiguous communities of diasporas. Now, I've traveled much over the last 7 years where my experiences have been varied and fascinating. From Cali and Cartagena in Colombia, where I had the opportunity to address a conference on the implications of ethno-education. And, not a lot of people know this, but Colombia have a law. It's called Law 70. Technically speaking, it's a law about education. But it's absolutely fascinating because it's the only place I have seen where Afro-descendants, who by definition have been brought to that space, are defined as indigenous. And it's a very important legal move because this law on ethno-education begins with defining the Afro community as indigenous and maps out their territory, states that they have different cultural ideas and mores and sacred spaces, which affects the education, and then goes on to decree the changes in education that are necessary. But all those gestures beforehand are really significant for reasons I won't go into. But it's the first time it's the only place I've ever seen Africans defined as indigenous for legal reasons. Anyway, so there were talk about the implications of that. I was in Argentina visiting our National Youth Olympics team and had a wonderful debate about the origins of tango with Afro-descendants there. And in Suriname, where I accompanied the Asante Hini on his official visit to the country on their Independence Day, and was present at a cultural display so profoundly Akan and moving that the Asante Hini himself stood up, and those of you who know Ghanaian culture will know how unusual this is. He didn't let his chame speak. When it was over, his spokesman stood up to go and I saw the Asante Hini tug at the man's cloth, tell him to sit down, and he stood up, went on stage and said one sentence, "You are my children." It was a profound, profound moment, and I can talk more about that later, about why that happened. But all I mean is I've engaged with Afro-descendant communities in places like Bolivia and Paraguay, where before I went, I had absolutely no idea the communities were as strong and militant as they are. The point is therefore very personal with me, that what these trips have done is to confirm the vibrancy of Afro-descendant communities, old and new, in diasporic spaces, and to emphasize the necessity of developing and upholding the work of making those connections stronger and more visible and thus more meaningful. In truth, before even arriving in Brazil, I had actually sailed around the world teaching on the semester at sea, a voyage which took us from Europe to West and Southern Africa Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and on to Hawaii before returning to the west coast of mainland United States. What this meant was that we experienced the connections created by the trade routes of those empires. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the British that shaped the histories of all our countries. I mean, we were literally following the Portuguese and Dutch trade routes that we were going. And you know, it was, you saw how those routes has shaped the world in which we live. And like following the 15th, you saw the 15th to 20th century unfold before your eyes. And I think it was the slow, deliberate nature of 100 days at sea that made that journey and made the connections kind of viscerally embodied experiences. And there really are connections between the Maroons of Suriname and their Kan culture, which remains a lived experience after all these centuries. You know, the thing that made the Asantehene get up was listening to a young man who didn't look as if he'd ever left Brokopondo, you know, let alone Paramaribo, playing the sacred drums. And I'm sitting beside the chiefs of his court, and they start chanting the names of the gods that this young man is playing on the drums. But the thing that was most startling was when he finished, we saw an older gentleman carrying a bottle come and sit beside him. And wouldn't you know, it was the most astonishing thing. They poured a libation. And at home, the rhythms they were playing, you were calling up these ancestral gods. And you've invoked them. You need to give them something to drink to send them back where they came from. But to be there in Brokopondo, Suriname in 2018 and to see that ritual quietly performed, it wasn't even announced. It was done quietly like it was everyday normal. It was so astonishing to us. So those connections are still real. You can see the legacy of the cloth trade from the former Dutch Empire that came from the East Indies through India and South Asia and South Africa all the way to become what is now traditional cloth in Suriname. And or seeing akara, which we eat for breakfast at home, become akaraje in Bahia, or seeing dokono, which is a savory dish in Ghana, in the streets of Accra, become cooked the same way, except in Guyana, they add sugarcane and dried fruit, and it's a dessert. It's not eaten with hot pepper. It's eaten with dried fruit and sugarcane, but steamed the same way. I mean, so you make all these connections. So you're sitting in a presidential palace in Georgetown eating dokno. They call it dokno. You think, what is this? And all those movements and migrations become a truly powerful experience. And I had examples from every country on the continent. I realize not enough of us have had the privileged experience of connecting the dots by traveling themselves to our interconnected communities as I did. But having done so, I really feel even more passionate than I have been about working with any community or organization I can to build ways to actively to share our knowledge and above all to create experiential ways of learning our stories and our best practices, because we really do need sustained activism across the board on education about our diaspora literacies. And it was particularly opportune to be the ambassador for Ghana, a country which had declared a decade of return for Afro-descendants when I was there. And that decade overlapped with both the end of the UN decade and the start of the African Union decade of the African diaspora, to encourage global returns and we are still engaged in creating favorable programs for us, and which I trust will continue. The administration that decreed them having lost the election, I hope they will continue. The Beyond the Return program is very important because it is a really diasporic program built on 7 pillars based on, an investment promotion, accelerated citizenship, a diaspora visa project, journeys, Sankofa journeys as they call them, making Ghana a mecca for the diaspora and a destination and a shared platform for healing and reconciliation. It is no accident that Ghana is the focal point of the AU for the discussions on reparations and developing heritage pilgrimage and an educational infrastructure and building a Pan-African legacy village. All of this to be branded and marketed and a roadmap for implementation. It's moving slowly, but it is moving. So here I need to turn to the matter that has been the source of debate. Long debate in the academy, but apparently less evidently in need of disaggregation until now in the corridors of the African Union. And that is the distinction between African diaspora and Pan-Africanism. Pan-African means many things to many people, and even those who identify themselves as Pan-Africanists are sometimes divided as to its parameters as a political and cultural movement and what means should be used to further its aims. At heart, it really is, or it seems to me, a term used to signify the unity of peoples of African descent around the world that recognizes our collective need for independence and liberation from the legacies of imperial and colonial rule. And these legacies are manifold and encompass such things as the strangulation of the development of our national economies to the needs of capitalist European countries. The one that always gets me is even the infrastructure of roads. You cannot travel east-west from Tamale to Kano. You have to go south from Kano, then west, and then up to Tamale. It drives me nuts. Why not? Why, after all these years, have we not built east-west roads? Everything is still the extractive systems of the global economies, north-south, coast to get us out. Used to be that way with phones until we became digital. But you know what I'm talking about. The dismissing of our sacred systems of faith, the destruction of our cultural institutions, the debasing of our languages, the fact that in many African countries for the longest time, you could speak 5 African languages and be marked on the rosters as illiterate because you didn't speak English or French or German. I mean, what kind of nonsense is that? Etc. The appropriation without attribution of our aesthetic forms. We know the list. The issue has always been around the politics of resistance, transformation, or revolution in bringing about the necessary changes. Part of the contestation, in fact, lies in who claims authority in being the voice of the Pan-African movement. A small but perhaps telling example within the movement itself lies in the very counting of the congresses, because that count generally begins with the first Congress convened by the US-born W.B. Du Bois in Paris in 1919. But if you do that, you ignore the meeting generally called a conference, which was convened at Westminster Hall in London by the Trinidadian-born Henry Sylvester Williams in 1900 to protest racial discrimination and the land policies of colonial countries. He had a thing there was a point there about the land policies still unresolved. So in addition to that first Pan-African conference held in London in 1900, there have allegedly been 8 Pan-African congresses. The first, 1919 in Paris, the second one in 1921, London and Brussels and Paris, London and Lisbon 1923, the fourth, New York in 1927, the celebrated fifth one in 1945 in Manchester, and then the less well-known ones, 1974 Dar es Salaam, 1994 Kampala, and 2014 Accra. I want to single out the Fifth Congress in Manchester, which was clearly a landmark turning point in terms of timing, size, and above all, representation, because for the first time, there were a number of continental Africans present, not only the Africans of the diaspora who'd been present at the earlier ones. And furthermore, those Africans were there as representatives of political organizations and parties, and not simply as distinguished individuals. And they were also there as representatives of labor and trade unions. And I think that those moves are important, that they were representing labor unions, trade unions, and political parties, and not there just as distinguished individuals, and that they were continental Africans, of course. Now, the absence of any adoption of regulatory mechanisms such as exist today for UN resolutions, for instance, make the direct influence of the congresses hard to quantify. However, even if one can debate what direct influence the congresses had on the independence movements in Africa, the Fifth Congress clearly had a great indirect influence, because 3 of the known young attendees, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Hastings Banda, had become, before the end of the 1960s, the political leaders of their own independent countries. And the ideas debated at that Congress permeate discussions on Pan-Africanism to this day. And there are some who would trace the movement even of the collective body from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, to the inclusion of the diaspora as a region of the African Union, in part as a response to the impetus of those congresses and that Pan-Africanism of that movement. Each transformation has brought closer towards systematic unity. Nonetheless, it's relevant to the matter at hand that not only is the beginning of the list of congresses controversial, so is the end. The Accra Congress itself was subject to much controversy in terms of timing, inclusive representation, and even subject matter too complex to condense here. However, the issues that challenged it are the very ones that have proved challenging to the organization of the 9th Congress, of the disappeared 9th Congress in Lomé. For instance, I was informed that the 9th Congress, originally planned for the end of October, was postponed to allow the organizers to make arrangements for consultation with all stakeholders interested in the issue of Pan-Africanism in order to make it a successful event. A very sotche voce way of saying the issue of Pan-Africanism itself is what is the issue. This is one of the very issues that plagued the meeting in Ghana, which the North American community declared more appropriately called a regional meeting because North Africa was not there, amongst other pertinent issues. In the end, again, there's a report of the meeting which is called First Phase, but there are no reports of subsequent phases, as there were, for example, for the earlier congresses, such as the second and third, which were counted as one, but held at different times in different cities. So the 8th Pan-African Congress remains somehow an incomplete and contested mission. The unresolved issue remains the same. Are the recent Pan-African Congresses representative of a Pan-African movement? What defines that movement? What is the status of the different national and transnational bodies as representative of civil society? And you know, if you Google Pan-African movements, you will get so many. The State of the African Union, which is a collection of civil society organizations based on the African continent, Ambassador Arikana Chow's notorious or infamous ADDI. There are so many of them. How do they get factored to have a seat at the congressional table? What role do national governments and the AU itself play? How far-reaching are the AU attempts to structure a process into these civic organizations within and beyond the nation state? Even when we meet, what rules of order in play are conducting meetings, and how do we square that with the much more informal rules under which the NGOs who often dominate the meetings operate? The issues are vast, primarily ideological, but also procedural, structural, and organizational. You name it, there's a problematic strategic issue lurking behind everything. The point I'm trying to make is that we live with this foundational contradiction. A real recognition of us as a vibrant community of Africans around the world, wanting to find a way to reach out to each other, finding different informal ways of doing so, and yet at the same time doing that despite being contentious communities of divergent interests with real ideological rifts, insufficient coherence, and above all, insufficient funding to build recognizable movement that can agree on legitimate ways of representing each other through coherent congresses. These issues became more acute the minute the African Union embraced the sixth region, and that region needed to meet. It's important to put the Bahia Sixth Regional meeting in context, because it was the last of the pre-congressional regional meetings the AU that had taken place. The AU made a decision that it was going to have that the ninth Pan-African Congress was going to happen, and that there were going to be pre-congressional meetings in each of the regions prior to them. And each of the regions did meet either in person or online. And then the last one was the one in Bahia. And so it was not arbitrary. You know, starting with the Lomé meeting, there had been a series of agreements which the nation states have followed through. Even the meeting on reparations in Ghana was a decision that has been followed through on. So in support of all these decisions, the AU decided, under the direction of Togo, that Togo was going to work with these regions and then have the Congress. So we all waited for this. We did meet in Bahia finally. Again, as I said, the Bahia meeting was postponed 3 times, and then we finally met. And again, we had this strange thing, a bifurcated structure, because all of these, it was billed as a Congress of Civil Society of the Americas, and the Americas did meet. I have no idea, therefore, where the diaspora communities of Europe and Asia met to prepare for this Pan-African Congress. I've been unable to determine that, because Bahia was the Americas. I don't know where the others met. The other, I realize I'm running out of time, the nation states have all started figuring out, how do we deal with the diaspora? Ghana, for example, has a diaspora officer situated in the office of the president. This is different from the ambassador in Addis Ababa, who deals with Ghana's state policies. The diaspora officer deals with the diaspora communities of Ghana outside of Africa, the civil society organizations. A number of countries have come to Ghana to try to replicate the success of our office. But it's singularly, like Senegal, Swaziland, Morocco, Kenya, Mozambique, they've all come to Ghana. But the singular thing is, all of those are outreach to communities of citizens living outside Ghana. They're not outreach to, for want of a better word, the old diaspora. It's like there's somebody sitting there working on pulling together the Ghanaian associations in London and Germany and so on. And each country is doing similar things. Kenya is reaching out and has produced a diaspora bond, etc. All of these people are dealing with, these people were born here. The AU itself has a plethora of platforms and organizations with which they engage. The ECOSOC, ECOWAS, SADC, as well as extra-continental regional organizations like CARICOM. But they all raise the questions about how are they engaging with the civil society organizations that are not associated with the nation state. As I said, Ghana has famously instituted a year of return, and we get a lot of press and a lot of play giving citizenship to a whole bunch of people, literally hundreds of people, going from the first group of 35 to the last of something like 180, but the most famous of which being the one, so Stevie Wonder became a Ghanaian citizen on his birthday this year, and it hit the airwaves. But aside from that, the question does not seem to be answered about how to mobilize those other individuals and prioritize them. How do you organize 170 million people organizing themselves in different cultural and social groups of different ideological persuasions and get them at a table and call them as part of the sixth region of the diaspora? That question of how to mobilize that passionate population has not, it seems to me, been resolved. And it seems to me is one of the underlying issues. Nobody's saying it officially, but it's one of the underlying issues why the Pan-African Congress has not yet been met, because there remains this uneasy tension between the formal AU structures and the AU decreeing that there shall be a Pan-African Congress, which by definition needs to organize civil society groups that have no formal affiliation or structure to the African Union other than an effective relationship. We did meet in Bahia, and we had a statement that was very fierce and very clear about the antecedent meetings on which Bahia was building. So the preamble mentions the Conference of African Intellectuals held in Dakar and in Salvador. It mentions the Durban Declaration on the Program for Action. It mentions the proclamation of the International Decade of People. It is very clear on all its antecedents. And they made this declaration and then gave a letter of 18 charges to the heads of state. But again, there was a meeting, true UN style, where the civil society organizations met. They did not meet with the heads of state. The heads of state met, and then the civil society organization brought their marching orders to the heads of state, which they are supposed to discuss at the Pan-African Congress. So, and they covered everything from the playfulness of our aesthetics to climate change and the need for re-education. It was a very comprehensive clarion call on behalf of the African descendant world, covering, as I said, everything from the transformation of education to reparations and climate justice. It was a document bearing witness to the state of the Afro-diasporic world. It remains to be seen how the heads of state and government of the continent to whom it was addressed will carry forward their testament to history. Thank you.